Welcome to another episode of AA Illustrates. I'm Micah Smith, and today we're going to be talking about 3 growth hacks to accelerate your automation program. So this is part of a greater series that we're doing, focusing on growing and scaling your automation practice. We all want an automation practice that grows and that scales and that's sustainable. And so this is part of a 3-part series that we're doing, focusing on automation program growth and scale. For Part 1, we did the start phase, and we were focusing on the 3 pitfalls keeping your automation program from growing. We're now into part 2, which is the accelerate phase. And in the accelerate phase, we're going to be talking about 3 growth hacks to accelerate your automation program. So this is going to be what you can do to grow more quickly and grow sustainably. Now, to help break down these topics, just like we had last time, I'm joined by Mark Goodaire. Mark, you want to introduce yourself and give a little bit of your street creds here?
Absolutely. Nice to chat with you as usual, Micah. My name is Mark Goodaire, and I'm the Director of Automation and Business Transformation for Automation Anywhere. So one of my primary responsibilities is leading our internal automation center of excellence. So the expression, some people say it's eating your own dog food. I prefer drinking your own champagne. We actually want to be using our technology to help our own company as well. So that's the program that I'm leading. I came off a few years with our professional services organization, and now very, very happy to be helping with our Center of Excellence.
Do you think that an organization that makes dog food uses the expression "eat your own dog food"?
That's a great. Probably they do.
Might be a little too close to home. So Mark and I use these kind of sessions all the time. We brainstorm together. We talk about different automation topics. We look at each other's bots. We talk about issues we're having, things like that. So we thought to record some of these and make them available to Automation Anywhere customers so that you can grow and scale your automation program. So Mark, our first growth hack, why don't you go ahead and introduce it?
So growth hack number 1 is about leveraging best practices. And really, this is about, is there a right or a wrong way of doing things? And you could probably debate that point, but the reality is that there are a lot of topics related to your automation journey where a lot of people have gone through a lot of pain and a long learning curve to discover what's the best way to do something. And some of those jewels have been documented and described, and they'll really just save us time and save us a lot of pain if we just adopt some best practices.
Absolutely. And so we've outlined here just 3 areas where best practices can be established and can help you with standardizing and making your automation program delivery a little bit more systematic. This is not the exhaustive end-all be-all list, but number 1 is development. And what are some ways that you can establish and leverage best practices when you're doing development?
Yeah, this is a great one. So when we talk about development best practices, we're talking about things like modular design, making sure that we've got error handling in place. One that we talk about a lot, Micah, that's very close to my heart is the idea of using templates or bot frameworks, so that we've got a similar structure to the way we build automation. We've got a lot of documented best practices that we openly share. And really what those become is accelerators to building an automation. When I build a new bot, for example, I'm not starting from scratch. I just don't do it. Why? Because to me, a best practice is saying, take an existing shell that's already got some of those good best practices baked into it and build my logic into that shell instead of starting from scratch. The solution pattern modeling frameworks, something that we've got on our dev portal, is also really powerful because we looked at there's lots of different ways that we can automate using our platform, lots of different ways, but we started to catalog them and say, these are the different patterns that we see in terms of solutioning automation. And you can look those up and see, what kind of control room access is required for them. How do I use those kind of patterns? And again, they'll save you a lot of time just by having those best practices available.
Absolutely. And we'll probably do an entire session, if not more than one, just dedicated to that solution pattern modeling framework, because you and I geeked out about that for a long time. And I think there's a lot of value that can be gained from that. When I think about development best practices, I think about the ways that we're going to organize our repository, right? Like structurally, we want to make sure not everything is just sitting in the root of the bots directory, so that when it comes time for migration and knowing where we have dependencies, we can see some of that stuff. Part of it, like you mentioned, is using the framework, which I love. I think your framework should do things like error handling, logging, log management. How am I doing my KPIs or my metrics, right? Those things should be baked into something I'm doing consistently. And if we reflect back on some of the things we talked about for this first session, we talked about quick wins. And quick wins are when you establish a lot of those best practices for how your organization is going to do things like this. So these topics all blend together in a certain way. This was not just ad hoc put together.
No, 100%, Micah. I remember one time I was working with an organization here in the U.S. And they were getting really excited with their automation program, building lots and lots of different automations. They had more than 20 full-time bot developers, and their challenge was how do we support all these? We're getting more and more automations, but our support organization is getting really stressed. And I worked with them. I said, cool. Who's doing the support? And I observed a little bit about what they were doing. One of the first things that came up is that every individual developer's style was a little bit different. So there were no standards. Well, if you have to support all those bots and everyone's got different practices around things like logging, it genuinely is a really big challenge. So I worked with them to say, hey, how about we bake that into a framework where all the bots are logged in the same way? It's going to be in this kind of format. It's going to be sitting in this kind of repository. Overnight, the support organization had an easier time. So that's where these best practices really can have a big impact in terms of the success of scaling your program.
Absolutely. There's also best practices as it relates to documentation. What are some of the documentation templates, best practices that you've seen?
Right. So the first thing I'd say here, Micah, is that, and this is kind of an interesting topic, how we deliver automations. A lot of organizations, including our own, have done different things around agile, for example. And one of the myths out there about things like agile delivery is that agile means no documentation. I've never seen it's kind of a funny topic, but I've never seen that be successful. There's always some kind of artifact, some kind of content that you need to have if you're delivering an automation. So these documents that are referenced here, things like solution design documents or technical design documents, test plans, hopefully with some evidence of successful testing, evidence that somebody's signed off on the automation before it goes to production. These are all key documents. Again, we can have templates and we can talk about what kind of content should be there, where should they be stored, and of course there are best practices around these kind of things. One thing that's gotten really exciting in recent years, Micah, is we've delivered products like DiscoveryBot, and now we've got Fortress IQ. These platforms actually help us in this area so that it's not even so laborsome of an activity to produce these documents. These platforms will actually help you deliver key documents like process definition documents. So that question about how we document is also a nice topic, and it doesn't necessarily mean sitting down at a keyboard and henpecking through a Word document anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. And documentation for developers is never like the most exciting thing to do. It's like the worst part of your development process. But the reality is good documentation makes the development process more easier. So like you mentioned a PDD, if my process is well documented and well defined, it makes the solution design easier. It makes the bot development easier. It makes the testing easier, because when I get to the sign off, I know that my bot addresses everything that was covered in that PDD.
Absolutely. And Micah, just to build off that, I mean, this really connects to another topic here, which is about which we're going to get to in a moment, about reuse, not reinventing the wheel. But another great example of that is we introduced this concept of solution patterns. It used to be that when we were documenting the design of an automation, we take quite a bit of time talking about the way that this automation is going to run is that it's going to be scheduled and at this kind of frequency, and this is how it's going to be deployed so that it runs every day at 2 a.m. Well, once we decided that, hey, there's only so many different ways we can deploy the automation, in our design documents, we really just point to the modeling framework and say, hey, you're wondering how this automation is going to work? It's using this pattern. And again, instead of taking the time to describe that over and over again, we just point to the modeling framework and our design documentation's got easier. So Absolutely. There are practices like that really make even your documentation process more efficient.
Yeah, I love that. The last thing that we'll discuss here, again, not the only best practice that you can have, but the last best practice we'll talk about is the way that you do change management. What are some of the best practices that you've seen around change management? What are the different ways you've seen organizations establish these best practices?
So this is, again, a very, very interesting and kind of hot topic. Change within our organizations is constant. And if we're to look at automations, there's specific types of changes that really, really can be impactful from an automation standpoint. I'll give a few prime examples of that. Would be, how's the application landscape changing? So for example, if an organization is doing things like introducing a new application, or the other way around, decommissioning application. We used to use this system, we're not going to use it anymore. We're replacing system A with system B. If we're enhancing a system, all those kind of changes can have an impact on our automations. What do I mean by that? Well, if I hear that a new application's coming into the landscape, my first thought is, cool, what's the best way to automate it? Right? Any application that comes in, I'm already thinking about automation. If an application's being decommissioned, cool, do we have existing automations that are touching it? How are they going to have to be changed? So one real important best practice here is that the center of excellence, or whoever's responsible for your automation program, they really need to be plugged in so they've got an ear to the ground of what changes are happening. Great example of that would be our center of excellence sits on an IT or software procurement council. So again, as applications are coming in, we participate in that forum, so we've got our ear to the ground to know that this application was approved, it's coming in on this schedule, and we've got an early heads up that it's coming, and we can start getting the automation conversations going.
That's great. Yeah. One other thing I think of here is really dialing in with the existing change process that exists within your organization, right? So going back to my experience as a COE lead, we had a monthly change request window, and we found that for delivering automations, that wasn't frequent enough, right? Because things were changing. We were trying to be very agile in the way that we were doing that development. We swung to a weekly deployment schedule, and that was too frequent, right? It was too much of a burden. People weren't doing good testing, and we were putting out sometimes garbage automations that people had created and hadn't really tested. So we had to figure out what was the appropriate cadence for us. What did it look like to do a code freeze? So just anecdotally, what worked for us is we would do code freeze and change requests had to be in by Monday, end of day. You would have a code freeze for the rest of that week. And then that following Thursday, we would actually release your code. And we would do that every 2 weeks so that there was the opportunity for us to push your code live, but there was a certain code freeze that had to be in place. And just back to our documentation topic, there had to be proof of sign-offs and proof of testing that was in place as well.
Right. And Micah, this is, especially in the age of DevOps, this topic has become really, really interesting. Kind of like we were just talking about when we say there's different ways of delivering automation. Traditionally, a lot of organizations would do almost like a waterfall approach when they're delivering an automation, meaning once I've got a fully signed off solution design, then and only then will I start development. And only when my development's 100% complete will I go into testing. Other organizations started to do agile development. Very, very similar theme here, right, in terms of how we deploy. In a lot of organizations that are doing full-blown DevOps, they've got continuous deployment in place. So it's a really, really interesting topic, and maybe not necessarily a one-size-fits-all solution, but I think some of the best practices around this are exactly the kind of things you're talking about establishing what is the process going to be. Is it going to be the same for every type of automation? Maybe I need to treat automations that are more critical or dealing with critical systems differently than ones that might be lower risk, as an example. But I think the best practice here is making sure that you define that upfront, that you've got support of your IT organization and the business stakeholders, so that it's well organized and well orchestrated.
Absolutely. Mark, what is growth hack number 2? I did it once, but 2.
This one's close to my heart. I mean, they all are, but focus on reusability. So don't repeat yourself, DRY. We could also say here, don't reinvent the wheel. So there will be all sorts of assets that come into play in an automation program. And the last thing we want to do is waste time developing something or creating an asset that really has already been created. So there's some examples here: reusable subtasks, reusable scripts. So for some of these kind of complementary technologies like Python and JavaScript, reusable action packages. So the first one is, if I'm about to develop a new asset, to think about how can I create that in a reusable manner. And the second one being, how can I make sure that people know what those reusable assets are? So there's a couple of really, really key pieces. In our processes, for example, we actually have a check at solution design stage before we go into development to say, okay, you plan on developing these kind of bots to support that automation. Have you done a check to be sure that we already haven't created that? We've walked into lots of organizations that have 5 different logon bots. That's a very classic scenario. So the idea here is to be thinking about reuse initially and how to bake that in. Where are those reusable assets going to be stored? How will people know about them when they're published? And make sure that we're not reinventing the wheel by creating assets that really already exist.
Yeah, absolutely. There's 2 ways that I've seen organizations do this, right? And I think you mentioned 2 good points there, right? Number 2, though, was how do I make sure people know about this stuff? Because reusability is great if it's helping me. It's even greater if it helps fellow developers and other people in my organization. So I've seen people create like a libraries folder within their bots directory that has all of their reusable assets in one place so that everyone knows, like, go check there for interesting subtasks that might be sorted by application there. So if it's like, oh, a login for Salesforce, cool, I'll just use this so I don't have to recreate that. And that way, if that experience for logging into Salesforce changes in the future, we just have to update it in one place and it fixes a lot of our bots. The second way that I've seen people do this is by using Private Bot Store. And Private Bot Store enables them to publish those reusable assets. It could be bots, it could be packages, it could be scripts, but it enables them to publish those to one central place where you can go and search for that stuff and see what our organization already has for this particular area.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you know, Micah, as you're talking, what's ringing in my ears is conversations that I've had with customers. Some customers even ask, you know, why do we even need a center of excellence? This topic is a prime one. I've got a great example for this. The other day, there was an automation that was proposed. It was coming up within our HR or people experience organization. And we got visibility to that because we've got a center of excellence. We know what automations are being proposed, what the pipeline looks like, what's coming. That automation needed the ability to review people's calendars and to schedule meetings with them. Well, guess what? The second I saw that, I thought reusable component. I could think of lots of examples where other automations can leverage that. So we had a simple discussion about it. We said, hey, when you're creating that bot, please make sure it's reusable. Please make sure it follows these kind of best practices in terms of how you design it. Now we've got a component that will be used for many, many automations. So when we talk about how do we scale, how do we how do we deliver more efficiently, this idea of reuse is really, really important. And it's a great value add of the center of excellence because they've got that visibility across the organization.
Yep. And I think we kind of already touched on these points, but I do want to make sure we hit them. Accelerated development time is obviously a huge benefit here, not only for myself and future automations that I'm creating, but for other developers, and that includes citizen developers eventually. Packages, for example, are a really great one because we have people internally who build packages. I've built packages. I'm sure Mark has built some packages. When you create that package, you're essentially obfuscating logic that is otherwise much more complex and making it easier for someone to use and consume that. And so that's a great way to accelerate the delivery time for someone else and your future self, so you don't have to recreate this every single time. Centralized updates is another huge one. Mark touched on that a little bit ago. We can make that change in one place. It's going to impact the other automations that may be using that particular reusable asset. And then we kind of already hit it, but citizen developer or developer enablement. If I'm creating these assets, making them available to citizen developers, like I said, kind of obfuscating the complexity of maybe internal custom services that we've developed, and I have a way for someone to very cleanly and easily interact with that service by just filling a couple fields in to a custom package or a custom bot that I've developed, that can really be an enabler for those individuals.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's a wonderful gift to give a citizen developer, especially when they're early on, one of the first bots they're delivering. If you say, okay, we're excited about the bot that you're delivering, before you get started, here's 3 existing bots, here's how to call them. You don't even need to do that. Like you say, great accelerator, a great tool for a citizen developer to know that, hey, parts of this have already been built for you.
Yeah, that's awesome. All right, what is our third growth hack?
So growth hack number 3 is all about democratizing automation. And the key really here is, of course, the center of excellence. I think regardless of what your organization calls it, I've seen different companies call it the COE, different things, but that function obviously is very critical. But when we want to scale, we must go beyond that center of excellence. It really needs to go into every different area of the business. And so what this is really talking about is how do we establish those roles and responsibilities? How do we enable business units so that they've got a constant factory going of ideas coming up that are being assessed and then being delivered?
So Mark, when I think about this, I'm thinking about two different areas where democratization of automation really fits. Number one is when we start to introduce citizen development and we start to enable business users and users across the organization to create their own automations. The second is when we're empowering users to be enabled by automation. And so I want to talk about those two and what that really means. Firstly, citizen development. Kind of what is that and what does that mean for an organization?
Right. So citizen development, basically when we get into that, we're talking about people that are outside of traditional technical roles. They might not report into the IT organization at all, for example. We're talking about those folks building bots. So we have, so for example, within Automation Anywhere, we've got folks in our facilities organization. We have several people working on citizen development in our sales operations organization. These are non-typical, non-technical roles typically, but those folks will also be enabled to build bots. So the challenge there is kind of twofold. One is how do we enable them with the skills they need so that they're comfortable building bots? And then the other side of it is kind of the guardrails or the governance around making sure that we're not introducing risk to the organization. And those are kind of the two pieces that need to come together. So we've got lots of great training courses, obviously, through Automation Anywhere University to help on the technical skills side. And then the Center of Excellence can play a really, really key role in making sure that those guardrails are up so that the right access is provided. We're not overwhelming people with bots that are too complex. And we're giving really the right level of access so that they can deliver bots that deliver value without causing undesirable side effects.
No, I totally get that. And I think one of the most interesting things is when you start to onboard, let's say, another business unit or another functional team, with citizen development, they have the ability to start to kind of prioritize their own automation use cases. So whereas the greater automation program may have their own list of priorities that are high value, aligned with the organizational digital transformation objectives, a team might have their own objectives that may not be as important enough to be on that primary automation program list, but they can start to tackle some of their own priorities, which I think is awesome for being able to kind of self-serve and be able to work on their own automation use cases.
That's really, really important, Micah, what you just described. Another way of putting that is there's lots of things that could be good ideas for a bot that might not be good ideas for the COE to develop. So for example, we have those use cases within our own organization come in. An individual business unit will submit an idea and say, we really want a bot here. Somebody's doing this work manually today. It's going to save us 25 hours a year. I would never say, when we look at those ideas, I would never say, that's a bad idea for a bot to do that. But really, I'm trying to focus the Center of Excellence on the highest impact automations in general, the stuff that's most complex, most scalable, highest value. So will I necessarily have resources in the COE to do a bot like that? I might not. And to your point, that's exactly where citizen development can come in. We have the opportunity to choose the citizen developer channel to still deliver those bots to make sure that they get them, but they're able to deliver them on their own.
Excellent. The other thing that we talked about here was enabling users through automation, right? And in Automation Anywhere, that means the use of RE, both from a RE web perspective and as well as RE desktop and embedded experiences. Talk a little bit about what that means for an organization to be able to enable users through automation.
No, it's really, really interesting, Micah. Just if we can talk briefly about RE and kind of how it changed things. Some might be aware that I started out in professional services. I spent several years there. One of the most important things when we're assessing use cases is the feasibility assessment. So we would have these checklists for feasibility. Somebody would describe a use case. We'd go through that checklist and say, is this a really good idea for automation? Is this something that's feasible using the platform or not? I distinctly remember our feasibility checklist used to have something relating to kind of human in the loop situations. So a situation where it was Mark needs to do something, and then a bot's going to do something, and then Micah needs to do something. Really, we used to look at those use cases and say, that's not a great example of where we can use our technology. ARI really blew our minds because all of a sudden we had a way of orchestrating work between human and digital workers. That kind of scenario which as it turns out happens all over organizations where a human needs to do something, needs to exercise some judgment. Then we've got some opportunities for automation. Then there might be some additional need for approvals, maybe some additional automation. That whole orchestration happens all over the place, in particular in cross-functional processes. Many things can be beautifully automated when they're approved, as an example. That happens all over the place. And so ARI really opened up and unlocked many, many use cases that previously just weren't something that we would have attacked. So to your point, in terms of having the business enabled, and again, from a user experience standpoint, they're now able to interact with the automation. Instead of the automation happening kind of behind the curtains at 2 a.m., now they actually have a user interface and can actually interact with the automations. And honestly, many of our business users, they just love the experience. Separate from the business value that's being generated, there's a user experience benefit there as well.
Yeah. I think one of the important things you mentioned was that, and I saw this in my own experience, we got stuck at a certain point only thinking of automations as something you schedule and then it runs and then it's over, right? And when you start to think about including ARI in your processes, now you're opening up this whole new treasure trove of possibilities for automation use cases that you can take on. So I think that's super important. The last thing I want to mention about democratizing automation is that a lot of this is enabled through the automation champions that you've identified, right? So if we think all the way back to that last session we did, and we talked about the importance of evangelizing your success and what your program is delivering, we said that it's important to identify those individuals who are automation champions because they can be change agents for growing your program in the future. At this point, this is where we're looking at those individuals to say, hey, how can we deliver for your unit, your business unit, your functional area, whatever you want to call it? And how do we empower that individual to either help us with documenting use cases, help us with identifying processes that might be good for automation, or maybe even empowering them to help build on their own a little bit, right? And so that's why this is like the full circle of that first thing that we introduced.
100%. If I was to break it down, when we talk about these automation champions, Micah, I'd say there's two really, really critical ingredients. The first is kind of the art of the possible. In other words, these automation champions, they know what the technology is capable of. They're already believers in the capability of what we can do, what we just talked about, what RE can do, how it can empower users. So they've got that art of the possibility. They know what the capability of the technology is. The other piece that's a missing ingredient is understanding the detailed processes. If we're in a COE, you've had that experience before as well, Micah, we're never going to understand every finance process and every HR process, every marketing process. But these folks, these automation champions, they're embedded within those business units. If they've got those two ingredients, man, can they be change agents. And not only within their own business unit, those are also the kind of people that can make this thing go viral by talking to their peers. Marketing person's now talking to sales, who's talking to finance about what the technology can do and how it's impacted their own areas.
Those who are closest to the problem can be most insightful to the solution. I'm pretty sure I stole that from here, but when we cut this up later, let's make sure that's attributed to me. All right. Finally, I want to talk about a recap. And just like last time, I want to focus on the actionable takeaways for each of these. So setting up and leveraging your standards. Mark, what are some things that organizations can get started on today to enable this and move forward?
Fantastic. So the first one, setting and leveraging your standards. Really, the first step is really quite simple. The first step is just review what existing best practices there are out there. We talked about a few of them. We have documentation on things like bot development best practices, control room operations. How do we monitor and manage an overall control room, for example? How do we document? We've got best practices in those different areas, so just reviewing them. One of the things that's so important when we review the best practices is that we become believers in them. So we're looking through those best practices and saying, do I buy into that? Look, if you don't buy into it, that's totally fine. But the ones that you buy into, those can be adopted as your own. And then it's the spirit of continuous improvement. A best practice in your bot development might consist of 3 points. We log, we error handle, and here's a template for your bots. Over time, it can be expanded. But the important first step is to review what existing best practices there are, and then just decide what we can adopt as our version 1.0.
Absolutely. And we'll include a couple of those best practice documents in the description below so you guys can access those as well. But use those, make them your own, change them, whatever. But I think it's important to make sure you've documented what the standards are at your organization. Mark, the next one we talked about was focusing on reusability. What are some things that an organization who's trying to build the muscle of thinking of reusability, what can they do today moving forward?
In terms of reusability, kind of low-hanging fruit would be get comfortable with our public bot store. What kind of assets are there? What kind of things have people already done? I remember just the other day, somebody sent me a message and said, hey, look at what someone's done in our community. And my mind was blown. So there's always new things coming up from the community, from our customers, from our partners. So getting acquainted with the public bot store. Think about how are we going to manage our reusable assets. So tomorrow, somebody in our organization is going to come up with a bot, like I mentioned earlier. It's going to be a bot that checks somebody's schedule. It checks Micah's availability on his calendar and books it. Where am I going to put that bot? How am I going to let people know about it? What's my publishing process? So working through some of those things. And again, no need to get overwhelmed. Just starting with a version 1.0 of we have a place to put our reusable assets. And over time, as we spot those opportunities, we're going to put them into that repository and let people know about it. That's a great first step. And like anything else, it'll grow and get better.
Yeah, I love that because it can feel overwhelming, especially when we're talking about all these ideas to say like, hey, you're a COE lead now, do all this stuff. But you're right. Make it something you can grow into. Do one thing this week, focus on something else the next couple of weeks, and you'll mature your standards for the way you do a lot of this kind of stuff. Last one, democratizing automation, right? What's a good way that an organization can start with democratizing automation and exploring what options are possible there?
This is such a great topic. I think if we were to get real practical, if we look at a specific business unit within one of our organizations, I would ask them things like, what are your current pain points, just in terms of your business? One question I love asking business users is, what's the least appealing part of your job? It is unbelievable how many times when you ask questions like that, something will come out that's going to turn into an automation opportunity. Because what are the things we typically don't enjoy? It's administrative stuff. It's repetitive stuff. I don't use too many brain cells for that kind of activity. Everything I'm talking about right now sounds a lot like I need a digital worker to help me with it, right? So I can apply my focus to more interesting work. So asking those questions: what's the least interesting part of your job? The least creative part of your job? What are your current pain points? I find very often those will spawn some immediate automation opportunities. And then I also ask them, hey, who's interested in developing bots? Who has interest in that? It's very, very rarely that there won't be some people that put up their hand and say, look, if I had some support from my manager, I'd put some time into developing bots. And of course, we're going to engage them and get them onto the path to being certified for citizen development.
Absolutely. Yeah, I like that. The other thing I think of is also like having some POCs ready, right? Like showing people, like you mentioned, the art of the possible. This is what it looks like to do document processing with RPA. This is what it looks like to have ARI and a human in the loop, and a task that starts with a human and then goes to a bot, or a task that starts with a bot and goes to a human, and back and forth, right? Like having those kind of demos just to show them will kind of help to spark some of their ideas on, hey, like we didn't even know that was possible. So I think that's another great way to be able to democratize that automation.
Absolutely, Micah. Just an example on that one. As our product is evolving, it's evolving in lots of interesting ways, and that makes that art of the possible really interesting because more and more is possible. You mentioned a couple minutes ago this idea of embedded automation. New capability that's come to the platform. Wow, now I have the ability to invoke an automation and see its status, see it running in the background, and see the outcome of it. And I haven't even left the business application. I'm still in Salesforce or ServiceNow or SAP, whatever the application was. We took that on the road. And again, great way to spark ideas. It's again, like you said, back to that art of the possible. People understanding what we can do in the platform, and then they can apply it to their business problems.
Absolutely. Mark, thank you so much for your time. For anyone who's watching this and is interested in learning more about Automation Anywhere, I would encourage you to check out Automation Anywhere University. There's a ton of free learning trails there. You can get hands-on. You can see how to do this stuff on your own. We also have Build-A-Bot, where you can register, get hands-on, build your very first bot. You can definitely do this, right? This is not something that is for only super, super technical developers. This is a drag and drop web-based platform. And so you can be enabled to create your own automations. So this was our second in AA Illustrate series of how to grow and sustainably scale your automation program. We'll be back with a third session next week. But for right now, thanks so much for watching. Please be sure to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and go be great.